Hello, everybody, and welcome to Being Everything Else with Silent Osiris and Skinny Ghost.
I love how on point you are with those intros. Like I can just sit back and be like, "It's cool. Steven will get this."
Steven's gonna take care of it. It's all good.
And just chill. It's cool. Hey everybody. Hi Steven. How you doing?
I'm good.
I'm glad you didn't burn down today.
Yeah, I
That's
do
nice.
not know what that was. I went and I picked up Kiska, so I have a cat again now, Chad. That's fun. So I can't wait for her to come out and be meowing at me during shows again. And then I came home and there were two fire trucks parked outside of my apartment complex. And I was like, what? Because I had like cat stuff in my hands. So I asked the firemen who were like propping the doors open, like, hey, is it safe to go in? And they were like, yeah, it's fine. So I went in, and as soon as I opened the door to my hallway, bam, smoke smell. I was like, are you sure it's safe to go in?
Yeah, it's safe. It's just still on fire. Just don't walk through the fire.
Yeah,
It'll be fine.
like,
Big red areas of the map. Stay away from those.
If I pass out from carbon monoxide poisoning halfway through the show, I guess someone call the cops, please.
That would actually be kind of funny. We're in the middle of a conversation, you just kind of like gap out and fall down on the floor.
Yeah, Adam, that would be really funny.
Okay, I would laugh for about 2 or 3 seconds, and then
Yes.
I would have someone call the police while I finish laughing.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it.
You know, I'm just looking out for you.
So, how are you, Adam? What's going on in the world of you today?
Man, I'm good. I'm at the near end of a busy week. I got tomorrow off, and then it's back to the grind. And by which that I mean pretending to be other people in a fantasy universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, things are good. I've been playing games, getting hyped up for my new campaign. Super excited to be on the West Marches again. Finally, Leper Squad.
Your new campaign is Apocalypse World, right?
That's right. Bringing it back.
I'm
I
excited.
haven't played Apocalypse World in forever.
How does it work for a longer form sort of thing? I mean, I've only ever played it for like one shots and or the 6 to 8 weeks we did on R&D.
I think we're probably only going to do slightly longer than the R&D. We'll probably do like 10 to 12. It's designed for that, right? Like,
it felt like it worked super well for that format.
I've played in games where you're just like, we're just going to play Apocalypse World until we get tired of it. And it always happens like about the like 12-ish sessions. You're like, cool. We've either all made new characters, we've retired our existing characters, or everybody has a +3 in everything. And you're like, nothing fun happens anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
How about you? What have you been up to?
Oh my God, just moving. Holy crap. It's tough. My new apartment is super awesome. I think I talked a little bit about it on Swan Song on Wednesday night. So if you were here, you know about that. You should see it's a little bit cleaner here behind me. Like there's no huge piles of clothes and boxes of clothes like right next to me and everything. I'm trying to like be a little bit measured with my camera panning skills. I've got my massive bookshelf back there. You can even maybe see D&D minis on that empty spot on the top shelf.
I love that you're like, this is my massive bookshelf. I need to show you my bookshelf sometime.
No. Don't you do that, Adam. Don't you one-up me.
No, I'm just saying, in terms of moving, like 90% of my boxes were books. And I was like, I am so glad that I'm in a position to pay someone else to carry these for me because Jesus Lord, that is not... I have tiny nerd arms. I can't do this.
50% of my boxes were books, and they were heavy. Damn.
Here's to being a dork.
Absolutely. So yeah, I've just been moving, and like I'm stoked to pick up the West Marches again on Sunday. So if you're tuning in and you're wondering when that's going to be, it's going to be 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday. We're going to get Gregory a whole host of new diseases.
Did you see that Gregory? I showed you in Skype that Gregory cosplay. Holy hot damn, that's so awesome.
That was super cool.
The best part was the follow-up where dude was like, no, it's not cosplay.
It's not cosplay.
It's like, it's my father's balalaika and my brother's sword, and it's...
That's so good. Like, that's just an awesome thing to say. This is my brother's sword. Yeah. Like, I know what it means. It means like his brother is a total nerd who collects swords, which is awesome. But it's not like this is the sword that my brother used for cleansing the eastern fields. Yeah. Do you have a link to that?
Very, very impressed. It's in my Twitter mention somewhere. I know it's cruel of me not to just straight up link it.
Yep. I wonder if I can find it from
somewhere. It's around.
I'll grab it. So, like, what are we talking about today, Adam?
Well, Well, today we are talking about a topic that is near and dear to my cold black heart.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about story, sarcastic quotation marks, in role playing games, particularly elements of a story. What is a story vis-a-vis a role playing game?
Yeah.
I have a lot of opinions about this as both a GM and as a game designer. I'm sure you do too. And I think this is going to be a good one. I think we're going to be able to get into some heavy stuff with this session because so often, like for me, I think this is an interesting topic because so often GMs are like, well, I'm trying to run a game and I've got this great story in mind and my players are wrecking my story.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Every time that I
I
hear that, I'm just
I have
like,
gone through that phase of GMing, definitely.
tear my own face off.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, it hurts. It hurts to be in that position, to be like, I have created this beautiful story that I will unfold to you over the course of 700 sessions.
Yeah.
And by the end, we'll reach the great apex of my story, and you will learn the final detail. And it's like,
The
oh,
truth.
God,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
fuck, stop. Don't anymore, please.
Well, like
Oh, it
I think
hurts.
that honestly comes from a legitimately honest place of
Oh, yeah,
of
totally.
that thought that the GM is responsible for all of the fun at the table, and it's like, okay, I have to give them something that's fun. What are all of the other things that you have in life that are fun? Well, like most of the time it's stories that you're reading or watching or playing in a video game or something like that. Like there's so much sort of cultural information that tells you like when you're sitting around and someone is and you're sort of creating a story together, it's because it's going in one direction.
Well, I mean, that's we just not even in our notes, but let's talk about that. Like, let's break that myth down. So, I think that there's a lot of people that we can point fingers at in regards to being responsible for that trope, right? And I honestly I think that it comes not necessarily from the earliest parts of tabletop like role playing, but I think that it starts once gamers started to consider themselves storytellers and games about like mostly about the story, by which I mean like the early to mid 90s and White Wolf and the kind of like move away from D&D. That's where it started to be like, okay, like we're taking this seriously. It's important to like focus on the role play and the story that's coming out in play, and I think that's where that really starts to happen. Because and just like you said, the idea that the GM is responsible for so much at the table, people start to assume, and players assume, GMs assume, and thus designers assume, because designers are GMs and players first, that that's a responsibility of the GM. That it's like you're in charge of the ongoing story that emerges from play. Just you alone,
Yep.
high storyteller,
Yep.
grandmaster of fiction.
Well,
the
it's
GM.
so much pressure to put on you, and then you're like, you want to do a good job because you want people to have fun, and you're the only one who can contribute. So you have to make it really good, and like, what if people don't like it? So you have to have a lot of it because a lot of something is definitely better than a little of it, no matter what. Right?
Yeah, and it's like if you're in that position where you're like, I'm the one in charge of the story, like I'm the story guy, and you're I don't know, it puts players in this really weird, awkward, like passive stance where it's like you don't get to you're playing, but you have to play my game. You have to play through the story I've made up for you. And I think that a lot of this can seem like if you're just watching people play a role-playing game or you're hearing someone talk about a role-playing game, if you're seeing it from the outside or you're seeing it after the fact, it's really easy to assume that the GM is doing all that stuff, right?
Yep.
Because the GM is like, oh, you do this? Well, let me consult my notes and brain. And oh, this happens because this was foretold to happen
Yep.
because I made it up in advance.
Well, also,
But-
like when you're telling somebody else what happened, it comes out as a story with, like it's easy even in the West Marches, which is probably the least story-driven possible kind of role-playing game. Like there are arcs that come out of sessions where it's like, okay, first we did this and we dicked around for a little while, and then we found this thing, and then we went and we did this other thing, and we came back to the thing, and everything blew up. And it's like it's easy to sort of look at that, extract it, and say, okay, after they find the thing, they have to go do the other thing. So how can I get them to go do the other thing? And then what? Yeah. And
Yeah.
And the West Marches as a game doesn't work like that at all.
No. No.
So
it's a scattering of narrative shrapnel. It's a minefield of stuff that might happen. It's a potential energy zone, not a laid out path.
Yeah, it's definitely the shotgun approach.
Yeah.
So like,
totally.
you know, we've said a number of times, and we'll say it again tonight, like there's no story at the table, right? Like it's I feel that it's a dangerous way to approach role-playing games, to approach them from this exact perspective we're talking about, where you have a plot and you know what's going to happen, you know the rising action, you know the climax, you know the resolution of things, and you're sort of trying to encourage your players down this path. You know, at its worst, this is called railroading in many you know, RPG parlance. But like, I don't believe in doing that. I believe in giving players a lot of agency, which means that they have the ability to take their actions and have them matter, which means making choice A instead of choice B changes the story. And that's how their actions matter directly.
Well, and I think a lot of this, you know, we can refer back to the very first episode of Being Everything Else, where we talked about what a GM is, right? And a GM is the narrator of certain types of character or action. They're responsible for judgment of rules calls in a lot of cases. They're the referee when there's conflict between players, but they're not the like big, like overarching narrative controller of the universe, in the sense that they can't see the future, right? Like you can guess at it, but you don't know what's going to happen in your game. Like when I sit down to GM a game, I'm like, okay, here's a bunch of potential stuff that may or may not happen, but players, you introduce players into any situation and your precious story evaporates into dust.
Yep. There's a common saying in the haha games industry that no game survives first contact with players.
Yeah.
Like no matter what, when you put it in people's hands, they're going to tear it apart, and then you're going to be like, well, shit, looks like I got more work to do.
So I think for me, like the most crucial thing to remember, the most sort of cogent point that we can make throughout this whole episode, the whole thing, the most relevant thing is that, like you said, there is no story at the table, right? What you're doing when you're playing a role-playing game is you are playing a game. And you're not, the game involves making up stuff, but there's no story. You're not walking through the story. The story is a byproduct of play. It's a thing that later, after the fact, if you're talking about the game or you're talking to your players, or you're just looking back in terms of like, how can I prep for the next thing? All of that shit, that's the story, but it doesn't happen when you're at the table. And so if it doesn't exist at the table, how in the hell could you ever possibly imagine a situation in which you could control this thing that doesn't exist?
Well, Adam, I have a fun thing about that. Someone in chat just asked, what? Let me see if I can find exactly what he was saying. Why is it wrong to try to plan in a big reveal? Luke, I am your father. This is XTC 269. Good question, and I think this ties directly into like the next thing we want to talk about, which is that stories can be broken down into certain elements that are recognizable. So maybe while you don't literally say, okay, first Luke goes to Dagobah, and then he gets his lightsaber, and then he, you know, flies back, and then he blows up the Death Star, and then, you know, you don't plan all of that, but there are elements that you can extract from that, and you can save for your game and say, okay, like this time, you know, if players do certain things, they can find out that in actuality, you know, the priest is a necromancer. And that's like, that is a part of your world. It's a thing that players can discover, but their discovery of it comes from their own interaction with your preparation, with your game world, and you allow their choices to matter. Like maybe here's two ways of approaching it. One, okay, the players discover he's a necromancer. He attacks them, they kill him, they win, the town rewards them. That's the story. I would advise you not approach it that way. Here's the second way. The players may, as a course of their adventures, discover that the priest is a necromancer. He is available for cooperation if the players try to harass him or try to bribe him. If the players threaten to reveal him, he will attack. If the players, you know, whatever, he may do other things. Or you could even just give him motivations. Motivation to resurrect all town members as undead. And then
Yeah.
like if the players show up, if it seems like they're on board with that motivation, then all of a sudden what he does in response to that is way different. He's just like, "Oh,
Right.
you want to yeah? Okay, go get like, the constabulary. We need to take them out."
I mean,
And then your story has gone completely different direction.
I think when you embrace that, and the best you can make, the best you can do as a GM, the best prepared you could ever imagine being, is just a series of if-then statements, right? Like
Yep.
you're never going to get better than if the players do this, then this might happen as a result. It's never a case of when the players do this, this will happen, and this is the next thing that happens, and here's the chain of stuff. Like if you want to be really prepared, you can come up with a series of those statements where, like, if Ben Kenobi tells Luke to go to Dagobah, then Luke might go to Dagobah. But Luke might also be like, "Fuck you, Ben.
Yep.
I'm not going to Dagobah. I'm gonna
Dark
do something
side
else."
for life.
Yeah, and then you're like, shit. Well, there goes my story. And then, invariably, unless you're prepared for it, you become one of those GMs that's like, stupid Mark Hamill playing Luke didn't play with my story. I hate him. I hate him so bad. And it's like,
well,
it's just not, it's not fun for anybody.
Maybe then you start like retconning the original story to like add in ghosts that are like, "Luke, use the Force and run to Dagobah." Yeah, that sort of thing.
It's just like, yeah, it's one of these situations where, and this, honestly, like, this is a thing that every GM, I think, runs into, where you're afraid that you're not going to be prepared for something, so you over-prepare, right?
Someone
where you're
asked-
like...
Yeah, someone asked me recently. Sorry, I'm sort of like jumping in the middle. Someone asked me recently on Twitter, "Do you ever get nervous? I'm running my first game of Dark Heresy soon. I'm really nervous." And I was like, "Abso-fucking-lutely, I get nervous. Like, I worry that I haven't prepared enough stuff. But then I sit down and play, and I always have way more prepared than I actually end up needing."
The amount of prep time to actual usage time is like, an hour of prep will get you 10, 15 sessions, because, like, I don't know, look at Mirror Shades. How long did that mission take to get through? It took me literally like 2 hours to ready that mission with a little bit of notes beforehand, and it took forever, like, for us to actually play it all out. So, I mean, I get that as a thing, and if you're a new GM, or if you're just getting started, or you haven't GM'd yet and you want to, there is that fear that, like, oh my god, what if they do a thing I don't expect? You really just it's like getting a tattoo. If you're too scared of how it's gonna hurt, you will never get one. Like, yes, It will hurt. The players will fuck up your shit. Just go. You're gonna be fine. It'll be okay. It's better to be prepared than it is in small, flexible ways than it is to come up with like a straight line. This is the game, and if they deviate from this, then we're screwed. So, I mean, all of that stuff is emergent in play, and you kind of like learn to not feel bad or worry about it. But I mean, I think that narrative, the after effects, the story, there's still a relevant part of gameplay, just maybe not in the ways that people often think that they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Like, you can leverage stuff like story and narrative and things you can learn from those things. You can leverage that as a GM, but it takes a little bit of massaging, a little bit of work to look at it in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. I try to look sort of at micro slices of the game and say, like, okay, in this scene, in what is happening right now, what can I do to make this scene feel tense, feel interesting, feel like there's a lot of potential for success and failure? So if you guys are super way behind on the West Marches and you haven't met the Three Serpents yet, then I'm sorry, because I'm going to talk about the Three Serpents. So when Galahad was approaching the Three Serpents, Death, Grief, and Blood, and asking them for a favor, that was a scene that, in telling it, it feels very story-like. It's like, okay, they come across this thing, they don't know what it is, they shoot an arrow, they wake up these guys, they don't know what they're going to do. This paladin decides he's just going to walk up and say hello. And then, in a very tense moment, Grief leans down and vomits forth a tooth that Galahad gets as a weapon. And like what I was keeping in my mind at that moment is that Grief is an incredibly powerful entity. He likes to be shown the proper respect. He is a very threatening creature. The Three Serpents don't always agree was a thing that was in my mind when this was going on. And so I was sort of allowing these things to come out in my description of the scene, the way that Grief sort of just stared down Gallahan as he was like, I walk closer. Okay, the serpent is just staring at you. The way when Gallahan grabbed the lance and started running, blood went like rocketing across the intervening space, diving for him to devour him. You know, a lot of that interaction came out not from things that I had decided beforehand, but from trying to create a compelling experience in the moment and knowing sort of what would crank tension higher, and applying those things.
Yeah, I mean it's less about having the stolid idea of the way that things will or must go, and knowing more sort of loose approaches to things like you said, like pacing in the moment or tension in a particular scene, being able to say these are the things that could happen that I care about as a player. These are the ways that, because as a GM, your only way to influence the game is through characters, so NPCs, through the setting, through descriptions of the setting, and through the situation at hand. Because as the GM, we can often say, okay, you are here, so we set the setting, this is happening, and these are the characters that are present. Now, you can't control the players, so all you can do is create an environment for them to basically dick around in, and hope that you understand your stuff, your playing pieces well enough that you can use them to react to your players, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you went into that prepared, not because you knew what was going to happen, but because you knew what might happen, right? You had an idea of what the characters in that moment were, where the players were, the world at large, and the situation, right? You knew where they were, and you knew about them and how they interacted with that situation.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and then again, this is why thinking about story as a series of plot points can hinder you as a GM. When you look at it that way, you lose that interface, right? The pieces become much more set in the way that they can move, right? Instead of having an entire board of queens and bishops, you just have pawns instead. All you can do is move forward one step at a time towards your goal as a storyteller.
Yeah, like I've played in games, and I've even run games that are very focused on story instead of like the emergent narrative at the table, and it feels so restricting on the game master side and on the player side. It's like, okay, you want to go back to the previous town instead of going forwards to the next town, where like clearly the next artifact you need to collect is, so that you can put it all together and like banish the dragons from the world or whatever. No, wait, a dragon swoops down and like starts burning the town behind you, and the road is on fire in the direction that you want it to go, and there's a big dragon. Like it gets so ham-fisted, and it feels like crap. But
I mean, I think the temptation is definitely always there when because as a GM, this is the thing, like no one in the game is explicitly responsible for deciding what happens necessarily. Like we're all reacting to each other, and I think that, and we haven't brought this up yet, but I think it's a good point that role-playing games at their core are structured conversation. It's not really storytelling. It's conversation. It's I say a thing, and then people react to the thing, and then I react to them, and then the rules react to the things that we're saying, and we're all conversing, and there's a story later, but right now it's just about that reaction. Yeah. And so nobody gets to say really like this happens, then this happens, and then that's it, right? We just pass that conversational torch back and forth. And so all you can really do is be ready to respond honestly based on what you want in the fiction when it's your turn. But you got to recognize that it's only your turn 1/5 of the time, right?
Yeah.
We talk a lot about, and I particularly, I know when I talk about role-playing games, I talk about the fiction and the narrative. And if you're not familiar with the wanky Dungeon World, small press indie game ways of talking about role-playing games, how would you be able to determine between the narrative, the fiction, and story? Because they all kind of, in English, mean similar things.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, like, I think one of the great ways to think about it is that story is something you tell after the fact, and story maybe is like what you might start out with as a novice GM and say, okay, here's the story that's going to happen.
yeah.
But when you don't have an overarching story, you can still have narrative elements that come out of the actions at the table. You know, even just when the party gets lost for a day and they have to walk back to Viraskali and then back out, that's part of the narrative of that session. It's things that happen, and the dice can affect it a lot as well. Like character choices affect it a lot, and then you know, when you're only rolling dice because the choice matters, then the dice affect the narrative a lot.
Yeah, and so like the narrative for me, and this the narrative and the fiction kind of blend together depending on how you look at the structure of a game, but it's like that's the imagined space that you're playing in together, right? If you're all sitting around the table and you're imagining this world you're creating together, the narrative is that shared imagined space. It's like, how do you see your character? What do you see them doing? What does everybody else see your character doing, as based on the things that you're describing? And it's just a combination of all that stuff. Like, it's setting, character, situation, description, and all of that goes into the narrative. And like you said, Stephen, like, depending on the game, you know, this can be more or less extreme, but the dice rolls affect the narrative affects the dice rolls, sometimes a lot, sometimes not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about that and how that works, you can generally divide games two ways, right? You have games that are mechanism first and games that are fiction first, right?
Yeah. No, I actually really love this distinction. And like tonight, I'm just gonna like talk about the West March as a whole ton because it's on
Yeah,
my brain.
sure.
Like I think one of the most important differences between like the experiences that I have in Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, other, you know, powered by the apocalypse games, is that these are very fiction first. They're very sort of like narratively focused and fictionally focused, and depending on what's going on in the game, your options are very different and the outcomes of those actions are very different. Whereas in my mind, the West Marches is a very mechanically focused game, which nevertheless manages to get out a lot of very interesting and very sort of unexpected narrative and you know, post game story from those mechanics interacting in interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think that fiction first games tend to translate more readily into story, because the mechanisms of those games tend to help you get
Hmm.
from narrative at the table to story after the fact.
Yeah.
Whereas a mechanism, the other thing is, like, in a game like Apocalypse World, for example, you're not ever really allowed to say, my character performs a mechanical action, right? I couldn't say,
I do
and
a
get away
spot
with it.
check.
Yeah, right. I seize control of his gun. I roll my seize skill. Cool, I
Yep.
seized it. I am the
Yep.
Caesar. Um, you have
Hail
to
Caesar.
describe it. Yes, hail Caesar. You have to describe it in play, right? It's fiction first. So the fiction is what allows you to make that roll. You have to
Yep.
justify it in play first.
Hmm.
But mechanism focused games, mechanism first games, the fiction emerges from the mechanism. So this is why often GM heavy games that are very authoritative in the GM side, they emerge from that mechanism first play, because a player might say, I make a spot check. They don't have to do anything else. They just say, I make the spot check. The GM says, cool, DC 15. They roll, they look at the GM, I got a 12. What happens? I failed. The GM has control there. The player didn't have to narrate anything, right?
Yep.
In D&D, I don't have to say, this is how I make the spot check, right? It's just, I do it. My character sheet
Hmm.
says I do it. I cast the spell. I roll the dice. It has this mechanical effect. Then we talk about the narration that comes from that.
Yeah.
And you can play those games with focus on the fiction, but you don't have to, right? The mechanisms of the game don't force that. They just allow you to play them that way. And I think that a lot of people run into problems because they're playing mechanism first games in a fiction first stance, right?
Mm.
Where you're like, okay, well, we gotta play the game, we gotta RP, right? You gotta describe your stuff, but the game doesn't help you. The game has no reason to
Yeah.
to do that.
I mean, that's like the game helping you is an important point, right? I actually like, even though I see the West Marches as a mechanics first sort of experience, I much prefer it when players approach their skills from a fiction first perspective. So, like maybe there's some sort of like needle where it's like, or maybe a pair of dials where it's like, okay, this game is turned up to 8 on the fiction first scale and like, 7 on the mechanics first, or 3 on fiction, like 9 on mechanics or whatever. But like, it always feels weird to me when a player is like, okay, I roll my Arcana skill. Does that tell me anything? And it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, what's actually happening? Like, you're in this world where there is grass and it's raining today and we know that, and tomorrow it's going to be thunderstorming, and like you passed some tracks of wolves earlier. Like, do you just have this psychic innate, sense of Arcana stuff?
Something that I think is really cool. Like Fitzy Chan asked a question. We're going to get into more detail on this in a second, but they asked like fiction-based systems circumvent the system set in place. Yes, absolutely, and we'll talk about how when we get to talking about fictional positioning. But I think the thing to focus on in terms of whether you're doing fiction first or mechanism first is that the line as a GM is really blurry, like between the two. And you watch Steven and I GM games that are mechanism first, we still, in my mind, ask players to justify the mechanisms, which, to be fair, not required by the game. That's us hacking live in play by saying, like if someone says, like, I make an Arcana check, you're like, how?
Describe it for me.
In what fashion? Like, how did you do that? What are you doing? What does your character do when that happens? And it can be as simple as, like, well, I stroke my beard and think back to a time when I fought an owlbear before.
Well, maybe we could even like describe like the D&D style of skill checks in 2 ways. One is mechanics first and one is fiction first. So mechanics first Arcana check is at any time, for no reason at all, you have the Arcana skill, you can roll against it. You don't have to say anything. It's a tool that you can leverage to help you solve problems that you're facing. So like, you come up against a door and you don't know if it's trapped. Like maybe someone else checked it and there's no trapped, but you still have a bad feeling because the GM is like, the door has like black lettering above it and you can hear growling from the other side or whatever. You've still got a scary feeling. So you're like, I roll an Arcana check. That's one way that you can do it. That's mechanics focused. Another way of doing it is having the game rules tell you when you have 4 hours or more and you have sufficient quantities of incense to burn for 4 hours, you may sit down, burn incense, and commune with the nature of the world to divine understanding about the magical energies in your immediate vicinity.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at like nothing triggers D&D skill checks except the GM requiring you to roll, or the player asking if they can roll. Right. Like the fiction doesn't touch the mechanisms in D&D except as an after effect, where the fiction emerges from the result of the roll by way of the DM explaining things. And so you end up with this disconnect between the play, the moments of play, and the moments of mechanistic engagement, where you're looking at your character sheet, and you're looking at the rule books and digging up what rules you're using. So, I think that there's merit, obviously, to both systems. Like basic D&D is very intentionally a mechanism-first game that puts a lot of pressure on the GM, but it works, right? It's designed for that.
Would you say that Torchbearer Burning Wheel, mechanism first?
No. So in Torchbearer and in Burning Wheel, they have there's a system for determining resolution of basically anything. So it's called intent and task. So in Burning Wheel, if I say to you, Stephen, all right, I'm having an argument with an NPC at a tavern, and I have a hidden knife in my boot, and I'm having this argument, and I say, you know what, fuck it, I'm going to kill this guy.
Yeah.
Then, as the GM, you would say to me, okay, so your intent is to kill them. So how are you doing that? What ability are you using? How is your character doing that? And I would say, I'm going to draw my knife, flip the table, and shove the knife into his face. Right? So that's the behavior. We've got my intent, and then you set the task. You say, oh, okay, you're using your knife skill he's going to oppose you with his speed. And if you successfully perform the task, then you get your intent. You stab him and he's dead, right? Now, if I had just said, I want to scare him, or I want to, frighten everyone around me, or whatever, I could still use the knife, the knife skill. It would still be the same mechanism, but it's coming from the fiction. And in a lot of ways, the fiction there is both external to the character, so it's the fiction of the setting, but the setting is also internal because there's intent. It's like, why are you doing this?
So like,
what do you want to accomplish?
Yeah, like in Dungeons and Dragons, there are only certain situations in which, persuade makes sense. And you can't really use it to do different things. Like if you're persuading someone by like flexing your arms and brandishing your weapon, that's not the persuade skill. That's the intimidate skill, right? So like, no, I see what you mean, where like the situation of the fiction determines the way your skills interact with the narrative of the game.
Yeah, right. Well, and I mean, that's the thing. Your character is just what's on the sheet, and what you see in front of you is primarily mechanisms. But if it's a fiction first game, you're using those mechanisms to define your character.
Yeah.
So it's, there's games that, and people conflate fiction first and mechanism first as being rules light or rules heavy. Burning Wheel, super rules heavy.
Yep.
Still
definitely.
Fiction first. It's about what is happening in that imagined fictional space that you're all occupying together.
Yeah. So like, like what else do we need to talk about in this first half of our show here today? Like, we're talking about fiction first, and
I'd love to go back and talk about fictional positioning, because I think this is a dramatically like under represented concept in role playing games.
So I just want to throw out like a caveat here. I have no idea what fictional positioning is even. Like Adam was like, "Oh yeah, fictional positioning." I was like, "Yeah, of course, yeah, type." So yeah, we're all going to learn something here today. Like, but this even goes to show you, like, as a guy who's run 10, 12 role-playing games, like, I've never come across this concept before. And I don't entirely understand what Adam means to say when he says fictional positioning. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say, Adam.
Fictional positioning. So fictional positioning is, it's in its simplest, it's the fictional space, like we were talking about, setting, situation, character capability. It's the space that they occupy that allows you to, as a GM, make calls about the rules based on that positioning. So if, for example, let's say we have two characters in a room, right? And one of the characters has had their eyes gouged out by orcs, and the other character has night vision. And they have like perfect like dark vision or cybernetic eyes or something. They both have incredibly different fictional positioning for making a perception check, for example.
Yep.
Or spotting a hidden thing, or however the game allows you to determine what is around you visually. And in Dungeons and Dragons, it's harder, because it's mechanisms first, it's harder to determine whether fictional positioning affects gameplay or not, right?
Yeah.
And so if I'm that character with no eyes, I'm going to be like, I'd like to make a perception check, and the GM is going to be like, you get a -8 penalty.
Right.
But if you're playing a game that allows fictional positioning prior to making those rolls, or deciding how you make the rolls or what you're doing, it's more about being able to say, how do you make that check? By what means do you do that, right? Because being blind gives you that -8 penalty. Whether you're eyes gouged out orc guy or you're Daredevil, guess what? You're blind, -8 penalty. Sorry, sucker.
Yeah.
And in a game, it allows you as a GM to determine, first of all, basic stuff like, I mean, you're doing fictional positioning already if you're a GM, right? All of the times that you decide whether something gets advantage or disadvantage, a +5 or a -10 or a +8 or whatever, you're modifying the roll. You're modifying it based on the fictional position of the character, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if I'm trying to persuade my best friend to give me 5 gold, I'll probably get a bonus, as opposed to if I'm trying to persuade, some random stranger on the street to give me 5 gold. That's fictional positioning, right? Now, in a game like a mechanisms first game like Dungeons and Dragons, really it's more about determining the mechanical impact of that stuff. But if you're playing a game that's fiction first, it could often be whether or not you even need to make that roll, right? Mm-hmm. So like this comes up a ton when, like, let's say you're a character and you're playing in a game where the rules say if you want to kill another character, you have to reduce their hit points to 0, right? And I say, okay, cool. Well, this character is unconscious and tied to a chair, and I have a sword, and I want to stab them. The rules say, okay, just keep making to hit rolls and keep stabbing them.
Yep.
I got 44 hit points.
I have the perfect example for this. 2 perfect examples, actually, which is that Dark Heresy is a very mechanics-first game. The way it's written, everything is very mechanically focused. It's when you attack an enemy with your weapon, you roll plus your weapon skill or your ballistic skill or whatever. So there's 2 circumstances, right? Jeff snuck up behind a shopkeeper. He was super distracted. Jeff was super sneaky. Jeff took his shotgun and put it up against the shopkeeper's back of his head, and he pulled the trigger. And I said, well, roll your whatever, and he hit him in the right leg or something stupid like that, and everybody was like, oh no, like Jeff was like, no, I'm right behind him, why don't you just let me shoot him? That's my Jeff impression. I'm sorry, Jeff. But like, because it's a mechanics first game, like the only action you can take with a shotgun is roll your ballistic skill. Like, and yeah, maybe as a result of being close, he had lots of like bonuses from the fictional positioning, but he didn't just get to like say, okay, because of the setup you've done in the fiction, you just blow his head off, which is what we all sort of wished could have happened. Second example comes again from Dark Heresy. It's when Total Biscuit wanted to eviscerate, I'm totally forgetting his name, the Mortician. And, he'd seen some heretical stuff on the screen that made him go crazy. And I was like, and he was like, I want to kill the Mortician. And I was like, okay, roll your weapon skill because you want to attack him with your like dendrites, your mechadendrites. And like we had to make like 5 rolls before he finally hit. And we sort of chalked it up narratively. Like the narrative that came out of that is that Angobart Kappa was so distraught from seeing the heresy that he was also incredibly inaccurate with his attempts to destroy this other guy. But it also could have been different in a fiction first game to just say like, okay, because this guy is kneeling on the floor and his, brain is boiling out of his ears, you can basically just reach over and tear his head off or whatever. So these are great sort of examples.
They're tied together. Games that are fiction first tend to give you a lot more stuff in fictional positioning to get what you want and not even have to make a roll, right? Like, If I'm playing a game like Apocalypse World or Dungeon World, and I've got to move like Defy Danger or Act Under Fire, and I don't want to make those rolls, right? Like, let's say my cool is -2, and we all know we're playing a role-playing game. Obviously, my cool is now -2, but let's pretend. Let's make believe. So I'm playing a character with -2 cool. I do not want to defy danger, right? Or I don't want to have to act under fire. So fictionally, I can prepare myself in such a way that I don't have to make that roll, right? Like, for example, if say we're walking through a hallway full of sentry guns, and we know they're going to be shooting at us, and I am like, well, hell, if I go through there, I'm going to get chewed up. So I'm going to put on my like cobbled together post-apocalypse suit of bulletproof armor, and then I'm going to go through. The GM can be like, okay, cool. You're not acting under fire because there's no threat to you anymore. The bullets just bounce off. You just walk through, right? And so people look at this, like people always ask me like how, I want to play Dungeon World because, you can't min-max in Dungeon World. Nobody can min-max in Dungeon World. I'm like, actually, that's not true. If you're good at fictional positioning, you can only make the rolls you want to make, never have to make the rolls you don't want to make. And it's good. It's a good thing to min-max at Dungeon World because it means you're describing stuff, right? You're engaging with the narrative. So you're able to say, like, these are the reasons why my character doesn't have to deal with this rolling bullshit because I am awesome in these ways, because I've set myself up by doing things in the fiction and undergoing. It's like, you want to fight a dragon, don't fight him with your iron longsword. Go on the quest, get the dragon killing sword. Don't bother rolling hack and slash. Just stick the dragon with it, problem solved. You already earned that success.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
that's fictional positioning. Fictional positioning is, what is your character inherently capable of doing or not doing? What is your character expressly better than everybody else at? And how does that affect the way that you move through the world, right?
Yeah, so
And as a GM, you got to think about that for the characters in your game.
it's worth mentioning, like, just to be super explicit about it, like, fictional positioning isn't like where your character is located in the fictional world that's created, like, is he 5 feet from the desk and 10 feet from the shopkeeper or anything like that. That's not what it describes. It's more like your character's sort of opportunities that are available to them, the risks that are present, and the options that your character has for dealing with those risks. And then there's another layer where it's like the mechanics that your character has at his or her availability in order to meet the situation. So it's like the position in the game world on that level, the position in the mechanical world on that level. Are there any other sort of levels to this? It's a very complicated sort of web of what fictional positioning describes.
It's not like, this is why we saved this stuff for so far along in the like series, because fictional positioning isn't something that comes sort of naturally to most GMs or players, because it requires a lot of kind of vague thinking about what a player character is in the world and how they occupy space and that kind of stuff. And we mean fictional space, like you said, Stephen. I don't have a +2 to my fictional positioning because I'm flanking.
Yeah.
I have a +2 to my fictional positioning because I'm narrating stuff.
Yep.
But it's like how you decide what role to make or if to roll. Like if you look at, I don't know if there's probably a few people in chat who've seen Blades in the Dark. Blades was at least early on expressly written to explore fictional positioning, in that based on the position your character is in, how well prepared you are, what your personal skills and talents are, how ready you are for the role you're about to make. Those things all decide which of the roles you make. So if you're in a shit position, like let's say you're locked to a table in the town guard's room. There's 3 guards. They all have clubs. You're stripped to the waist. You don't have any weapons, and you're drunk as shit. Your fight roll with them is going to, at best, result in poor judgment and bad situation.
You're gonna get rocked.
Yeah, like it doesn't matter.
Someone in chat who said it, I'm looking. Knight Templar GT says, like when JP killed an owlbear by dropping a statue on it.
Yes.
Yep. Like I had him do some rolls.
I
had him do some rolls, but like, man, that was the perfect way. Like he described a bunch of setup. We set up a negative situation for the owlbear. Everybody sort of like chipped in to make this bad thing happen. Zeke went off and did his own thing and got wrecked, and then JP dropped a statue on the owlbear. Perfect fictional positioning.
You're seeing already how fictional positioning leads into resolution, which leads into the narrative and becomes a good story, right? Because all of that stuff is about how do we solve this problem with the crap we have available to us, not on our character sheet, but as a character in the world. And solving problems in the fiction is always more satisfying than throwing dice at them, right? Yep. There may be roles to resolve issues, but that's always way more satisfying, at least in my mind. And so you can play games, like I was saying, like with Blades, where the best or worst results you can get are reliant on your fictional positioning, or you can incorporate fictional positioning into games you're already playing by thinking about what position is this character in, how does that modify whether or not they make rolls, or if they do have to make a roll, how does it modify what that role is, and how successful they're likely to be at it.
Man, now I'm thinking like, I mean, like, obviously there are elements of fiction and elements of mechanics in all of the games that we play and talk about regularly. But like when I said earlier that the West Marches was a very mechanics-first game, I'm not entirely sure, because I really enjoy this sort of stuff that comes out when players are clever and they find that sort of dropping the statue on it solution. Maybe there are parts of the game that are mechanics first, like traveling, like, sort of time passing and things like that. And maybe there are other parts of the game. So like what's happening right now in this moment where it's like no more than 5 or 10 minutes can pass, from beginning to end of this scene. Like that maybe is much more about fictional positioning.
Yeah, and I think that like every role-playing game has elements that are more fictionally driven and more that are mechanically driven. Like, look at Dungeon World. The fighter is a mechanically oriented class, and the druid is a fictionally oriented class,
big
right?
time.
The druid, you just fictionally position your way to success. So your attack bonuses and stuff, not that great. The fighter, you can rest assured that when you need to kill something, chances are pretty good you're going to be able to kill it in the fashion that you want, right? You're really good mechanically at getting what you want from that one thing that you do.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you said, there's games that do a little of column A, a little column B, and GMs that rely more or less on others. Like I think that you look at a role-playing game, and the best you're going to get is part way to what it'll actually be like at the table, because as a GM, you're bringing all of your past experience and baggage to the game with you, whether you want to or not, right? And you have to work actively to either embrace or reject that stuff.
So, yeah, like I dropped in here like a couple of links. Like, you know, have we sort of extracted a lot of information about fictional positioning, games that rely on fiction first versus games that rely on mechanics first? Are we comfortable with the way we've covered these topics, Adam?
I mean, I think so. I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer about these topics, but I mean, I think I don't want to like overload people with RPG theory, but like.
Yeah.
My takeaway would be that like, if you've already embraced the idea that you can't be in control of the narrative all the time, whether you're the GM or a player, you can look at how you position yourself fictionally, or position your NPCs, or position the players fictionally within the setting and the situation. You can think about that from a GM perspective and say, okay, how does this affect my game, and what is it doing to the way that I interact with the rules, and how I interact with my my players?
Yeah.
Right?
So, like, do you think that there are situations in which fictional positioning is more powerful versus situations in which there isn't? Is there a way as a GM that you can prepare yourself to allow fictional positioning to be a strong tool that the players have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes back to the whole like idea of killing your darlings, right? Is like, don't use the rules to protect your shit as the GM,
Yes.
right? Like, this is funny because we talk about this stuff a lot on Being Everything Else, and a little bit in Hack Attack, and just generally, these are topics that we talk about a lot. But when people are watching us GM, I notice a lot of like, well, you said in this episode, and it looks like you're trying to do this, and like, you know, you kind of have to trust that we're following our own advice, but it's from the outside, it's hard to tell sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. Where like, you know, you want to position, like, it's hard. Look at like Constantine Fang in Swansong, right? Like, he's fictionally positioned to be pretty huge badass, right? And I've chosen mechanisms to back that up, right? I gave him gear that would indicate his badass nature. He has a high level of skill in all the badass stuff he needs to do. He's basically just a high level PC, but running at opposite to the PCs. And for me, the way to allow fictional positioning to take the fore is if your players have non-mechanical solutions to their problems, give them as much opportunity to solve their problems that way as you would to give someone with like a high to hit bonus, right? Like, you can fictionally position your NPCs, or fictionally position the obstacles in front of the characters as being, you know, incredibly daunting, but give them the freedom to overcome that stuff in creative ways.
Yeah.
And people will start to rely on that.
Like, I think for me, a big thing about allowing fictional positioning to be a thing that your players can use, that comes out of your table, is that idea that we talked about very first of like not locking yourself into a plot, not locking yourself into a story, but instead like thinking about motivations, thinking about the character, the setting, and the situation in order to make sure that you know enough about what's going on that you can know any number of outcomes, any array of outcomes from the situation, depending on what your characters choose to do. Be real quick before we go to a break here. I think it's valuable to talk about how, as a GM, you can prepare yourself from the stories that you're reading in order to allow those sort of circumstances to come out in your game. Something that I like to think about a lot is what's called the 36 dramatic situations, and I'll drop a link to that in chat as well. But like, it's sort of it's a descriptive list created by Georges Polti to categorize theoretically every dramatic situation that might occur in a story or performance. I don't really know how accurate that is or not, but it's still like you can watch movies, you can watch TV shows, you can read books, and you can sort of extract sort of elements of what has happened and pull those individual elements into your game. And so being familiar with circumstances that occur often in fiction and sort of the ways that characters relate to each other and not exactly the characters, but the roles they perform in the fiction is something that you can use powerfully to create situations that your characters can interact with in a number of interesting ways, and that they can change their approach based on how they would like the fiction to go. So, like, let's look at the first one, supplication. There's a persecutor.
Before we get too much into these, so these 36 situations, like I've used these before in games, but not as a this is going to happen.
Yes.
I've used these tons as this has already happened, and thus motivates NPCs or a situation. So yeah, you give us some examples. Maybe pick one about a dinosaur.
I'm totally on board with that. Pick one about a dinosaur. What?
Yeah, number 27, discovery of the dinosaur of a loved one.
Oh my God, you're right. Jesus, I need to read this list more. Yeah, so like it's important to be like, okay, supplication, number one, a persecutor, a suppliant, a power and authority whose decision is doubtful. Like, it's dangerous to put players in the role of one of these things and assume that the situation will occur as written here. But what you can do is you can say this situation is occurring outside of the players, and they're sort of onlooking, and they're sort of like all interacting with what's going on. So like a persecutor, a suppliant, a person in authority. God, what is it? If you've been watching the Misclicks Nimmergeist show over on youtube.com/misclicks, which you should, and you've seen Trial by Pi, then you know this situation. So there is a persecutor, which is sort of, I guess, interestingly, God, what was his name? There's a judge, and he is both the persecutor and the person in power. And the players sort of play the role of the suppliant, and it's sort of a twist on it because there's two suppliants where that's the players versus an NPC. But because the players are in the sort of uncertain situation, it gives them a lot of opportunities for how they can address the fictional challenge before them. And we got like 2 or 3 episodes, like basically an hour to 2 hours of gameplay out of this situation that arose. And all I needed to know is that the players are in trouble. There's someone who wants to see justice carried out, and they've determined that justice must be carried out in a completely ridiculous fashion.
Yeah, and so these are really interesting as you can think of them as scenes to frame. You can think of them, all of them make great kickoff points for a game. Like you could say, okay, so like let's pick a random one. Let's do remorse. So a culprit, a victim, an interrogator. You could start a game by saying, okay, so you've finally caught the man who committed this horrible crime, and you're trying to get him to admit to a secret. What did he do? What is it you're trying to get him to admit to? Like, these are all great for starting a game or for having in the background for something that's already happened. So you can say that these characters are in conflict because of, involuntary crimes of love or rivalry of kin, or, it's so simple to take such a really basic thing and spin out a situation from it, but never in a million years try to make the game go down the channel of one of these things.
Like these things, for example, I could take every single one of these items, the 36 situations, and I could plop them into hexes in the West Marches and say, okay, in hex 36, 34, there is supplication. In hex 48, 42, there is a crime pursued by vengeance. These aren't things that will happen. These are situations the players can discover and then interact with however they want. But it's a great way to just like populate content and just be like, okay, this mission is about a disaster. There's a vanquished power and a victorious enemy or a messenger sort of dealing with that. And, draft up a couple little extra, sentences about what's happened, about the motivations of the involved parties, and about the situation as it is when the players find it. And then you're ready to go.
If you and I think this for me, like, this would be the point to kind of like go out on to tie us back to the whole, like, you're not in the position of writing a novel. You're not a fucking novelist. You don't have to be one. You're GM. You're contributing to an ongoing narrative. But if you want to imagine what things would be like as they played out, if you want to like think about an arc, just imagine that situation if the PCs never showed up. Right? And then you can insert the PCs at any time. You can tie it to the timeline of the game. You could say what began as a disagreement between a husband and wife might escalate to conflict with a god, and let's figure out how they get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And if the players encounter character A and B at the beginning, it's just two bickering husband and wife. But if they encounter them midway through, the husband has become an insane cultist to get revenge on his wife, who is stolen away from him by a paladin. And if they get there at the end, it's like, well, you just missed him summoning his dark god to get revenge. What are you going to do about that?
Yep.
So there is space for a narrative arc, but think about it in terms of, if the other characters were just not involved, how would this go? And then you have so much flexibility in terms of adjusting it and thinking about the direction that it might go in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a good time for our first break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about specific role-playing games, because that's like the way we structure our show always. It's like first half is theory, second half is the games themselves. And man, like, I haven't found a lot of games that do all of this stuff very well. So we're going to talk about like some of that. So 5-minute break, don't go away. We'll be right back after these messages.
See you soon.